December 20th, 1941, Kunming, China. The morning is cold and thin, the way mornings are at 6,200 feet above sea level, the kind of cold that settles into the joints and makes men slow. The P-40 Warhawks sit on the packed earth of the airfield, with their shark teeth grins painted white against the nose, rows of pointed triangles that look, in the early light, like something alive and patient. The ground crews have been at the aircraft since before dawn. The fuel lines are connected. The .50 caliber machine guns are loaded. The armourer who worked through the night is drinking tea from a tin cup near the edge of the strip. Then the warning telephone rings. Japanese bombers heading for Kunming. 10 Kawasaki Ki-48 twin-engine bombers and their escort coming from the direction of Hanoi. They will arrive in 40 minutes. What the Japanese pilots expected as they crossed the mountains towards the Chinese city was what they had encountered everywhere else in Asia since the war began. Aircraft rising too late, too few, caught low, caught slow, caught unprepared. In every theatre since Pearl Harbor, in every engagement since the invasion of China began in 1937, Japanese air power had met resistance that was brave, earnest, and ultimately insufficient. The mathematics of altitude and surprise always favored the aggressor. The Japanese air crews had every reason to believe today would be the same. They had not met the Flying Tigers yet, and among all the men who climbed into the shark-mouthed P-40s that morning, among all the former Navy and Army and Marine pilots who had quit their commissions and crossed the Pacific under false passports, drawn by the chance to fight before America entered the war, there was one man whose way of flying the Japanese would spend the next 7 months trying to understand, and failing. His name was David Lee Hill. He was 26 years old. And what he was about to do over the skies of Kunming would violate almost every rule of aerial combat his instructors had ever taught him. To understand what happened over Kunming and over Rangoon and over the Salween River Gorge and over Hong Kong in the months that followed, you must first understand the machine that made it all possible and the man who believed in it when almost no one else did. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was not by any objective measure the best fighter in the Pacific in 1941. It was slower than the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 above 15,000 feet. It could not turn as tightly as the Ki-27 Nate in a horizontal circle. In the kind of swirling, turning, energy-trading, close-quarters dogfighting that formed the foundation of aerial combat doctrine in every air force in the world, the P-40 would lose. These were not opinions. They were physics, and every qualified test pilot who had flown both aircraft confirmed them. The prevailing expert consensus was unambiguous. The P-40 was an adequate aircraft, useful for ground attack, passable in a pinch. Against the Japanese fighters it would face in Asia, it was considered by most of the United States Army Air Corps establishment to be fundamentally outmatched. Claire Lee Chennault disagreed. Chennault was a retired Army Air Corps officer who had been advising the Chinese Air Force since 1937. He was 48 years old, partially deaf, stubborn to the point of institutional insubordination, and possessed of a tactical mind that the Army Air Corps had found so uncomfortable, so insistent on arguing against established doctrine, that it had effectively forced him out of service. He had spent 4 years studying Japanese aviation from the ground, building a network of spotters across China who telephoned warning ahead of approaching Japanese aircraft. He had observed every Japanese raid on Chongqing. Would every Japanese fighter sweep across the Chinese interior? He had filled notebooks with what he saw. He had drawn conclusions that the official military experts had dismissed. The Zero and the Nate, Chennault understood, were built for one kind of fight: light, maneuverable, able to turn inside anything at low and medium speed. But their lightness came at a cost. They had no armor protection for the pilot. They had no self-sealing fuel tanks. Their structural integrity in a high-speed dive was inadequate. In certain conditions, if a Ki-27 pilot pushed his aircraft too hard in a downward acceleration, the airframe would fail, and they could not match the P-40 in straight-line diving speed or in the brief, brutal violence of a head-on pass at high velocity. Chanot therefore prohibited his pilots from doing what every one of them had been trained to do. No turning dogfights, no extended maneuvering, no trying to outturn a fighter that could fly circles around them. Instead, altitude. Climb before the enemy arrives. Hold position above the incoming formation. And then, when the moment is right, dive. Not cautiously, not partially, all the way. A full-speed slashing attack through the formation, guns firing, committed completely, and then the nose comes up and the P-40 climbs back on the speed it has accumulated from the dive, the repositioning for another pass before the Japanese pilots have recovered their orientation. Dive and zoom, hit and run. To the Japanese pilots who encountered it for the first time, it looked like nothing they had ever seen. It did not conform to any pattern of rational aerial combat. A fighter does not simply dive through an entire formation at full speed and keep going. A fighter pilot does not attack at angles that forfeit all possibility of sustained engagement. It was, by the standards of everything they had been taught, erratic, impulsive, uncontrolled. To the Japanese, accustomed to opponents who engaged and turned and traded altitude and position in the established choreography of the dogfight, it looked like a man who did not know what he was doing. It looked, if anything, like a drunk. David Lee Hill was born on July 13, 1915, in Gwangju, Korea, where his parents were Presbyterian missionaries. The family returned to the United States when he was 15 months old and eventually settled in San Antonio, Texas, where his father ministered to a congregation and young David grew up reading the sky for weather the way farmers do, with attention and patience and an understanding that the air has its own physics and its own rules. He was not by any standard assessment a candidate for historic significance. He had attended Texas A&M for 2 years before transferring to Austin College. He had won the Tennessee Middleweight Boxing Championship in 1934, which meant he understood at a cellular level that the fight is won by the man who hits first and moves before the counterpunch arrives. He had earned his naval aviator wings in 1939 at Pensacola and been assigned to a torpedo bomber squadron on the USS Saratoga, then to a dive bomber squadron on the USS Ranger. He was a good pilot, competent, reliable. Nothing in his record suggested that he would become one of the most lethal aerial combat pilots in the China-Burma-India theater, a man whose kill tally would ultimately reach 18 1/4 confirmed victories. The fraction, because one aircraft, downed in a 4-man engagement over the South China Sea, had to be shared equally. In 1941, a recruiter named Skip Irvine sat across from Hill and explained the terms. He would resign his Navy commission. He would be issued a false passport, identifying him as a Texas rancher. He would board a Dutch passenger liner in San Francisco and travel to Rangoon, Burma. He would fly under contract for the Chinese Air Force against an enemy that outnumbered him in every metric the military uses to define advantage. He would receive $600 a month and $500 for each confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed. The United States government would deny all knowledge of his existence if things went wrong. He signed the same day. He arrived in Burma in September 1941. For 3 months, under Chanot's instruction, he learned to unlearn. He had to take apart everything he believed about aerial combat and rebuild it according to principles that contradicted his training so completely that in the first weeks the discomfort was almost physical. You do not turn and fight. You do not stay. You dive, you shoot, you go, you climb, you come back. The fight is not a conversation. It is a sentence. Short, violent, over before the other man has decided what to say. By December 1941, he was ready, and the sky above Kunming was waiting. On January 3rd, 1942, Hill makes his first kills. The mission is a strike against the Japanese airfield at Tak in Thailand. His P-40 drops from altitude in that familiar diving pattern, the one that from below looked so disorganized that Japanese ground observers initially filed reports suggesting the American pilot was experiencing mechanical difficulty. The aircraft seems to swerve and stagger as it comes down. The angle shifts, the nose oscillates. No trained pilot attacks this way. And then, at the last possible second, the guns open, and two Ki-27 Nates are torn apart before their pilots have completed a single defensive maneuver. Hill climbs away at full throttle. He is on the ground at Kunming before the Japanese at Tak have finished counting the debris. 3 weeks later, on January 24th, he becomes an ace, a bomber and a fighter over Rangoon. 2 more aircraft turned into falling metal by a man who is already so comfortable with this inverted logic of aerial survival: attack where you cannot be followed, disengage before they recover, never ever accept the fight on their terms, that the process has begun to look to his fellow pilots almost casual. The Japanese do not find it casual. Japanese air commanders begin filing intelligence reports, noting an unusual pattern in AVG engagements. The enemy, the reports observe, does not maneuver in the accepted fashion. The dives are steep beyond normal parameters. The attack angles are inconsistent. There is no apparent pattern to the approach geometry. One Japanese pilot, whose account was later preserved in post-war interviews by historian Daniel Ford, described the experience of being engaged by the AVG's dive and zoom tactics in terms that have no military equivalent in Japanese aviation writing of the period. He said it was like being attacked by something that had not read the rules. The Japanese tactical answer was the same it always was when established doctrine failed: more aircraft. Overwhelmed through numbers what cannot be answered through technique. Send larger formations. Except that some would be lost to this strange, swooping, diving, climbing American pattern, but trust that enough would survive to complete the mission. They were wrong about the mathematics. By January 24th, 1942, 5 weeks into the AVG's combat operations, the Flying Tigers had destroyed 73 Japanese aircraft while losing only 5 of their own P-40s in combat. The ratio was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the systematic exploitation of an asymmetry that Chanot had identified 4 years earlier in his notebooks, and that his pilots, Hill most visibly among them, had internalized to the point where the unorthodox had become reflex. The symbol of this war, if you were looking for one in the dust of the Kunming airfield, was the shark teeth. Someone in the first weeks of the AVG's existence had painted white triangles on the P-40's air intake, all creating the grinning mouth of something predatory. It was not official. It was not authorized. The nose art spread from one aircraft to the next, painted by ground crews in their spare time, because it expressed something true about how these men fought. They did not meet their enemies eye to eye in the gentleman's duel of the turning dogfight. They came from above, from the wrong angle, at the wrong time, in a way that offered no defense and no warning. The teeth on the nose were not decoration. They were documentation. The Japanese began to call the P-40s the Flying Tigers, a name the Chinese press adopted and sent around the world, and which President Franklin Roosevelt would later use in a message of commendation. But the name that mattered was not the Tigers. The name that mattered was the pattern, the dive, the zoom, the attack that looked like disorder and was, beneath its apparently reckless surface, all the most precise response possible to the specific weaknesses of the aircraft the Japanese were flying. May 7th, 1942. The Salween River Gorge. This is the day that decides the fate of China's Western Front, and it is David Lee Hill who decides it. The Japanese 56th Division has begun building a pontoon bridge across the upper Salween River. If the bridge is completed, Japanese armor and infantry can advance up the Burma Road toward Kunming. The Chinese army cannot stop them on the ground. Chennault has 4 brand new P-40E Warhawks, 6 heavier .50 caliber machine guns each, and 570-pound Russian bombs that the Chinese government has obtained from its Soviet advisors. He has Hill. Hill leads the flight into the mile-deep gorge. The geometry is unfavorable in every respect. The gorge walls limit approach angles. The Japanese column below, vehicles and troops and artillery stretching from the river's edge to the top of the plateau, fills the canyon floor. The dive will carry the aircraft dangerously close to the gorge walls before the pullout. Defensive fire from the ground is intense. Hill goes in anyway. The Russian bombs tear the road apart. The vehicles at the river's edge cannot advance. The vehicles behind them cannot reverse through the ones that have already stopped. When the entire Japanese column, thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles, is trapped in a gorge with no exit and no cover for 4 consecutive days, while the AVG returns again and again and again. The Japanese 56th Division does not cross the Salween. It never does. From that day forward, the Japanese never advance beyond the west bank of the upper Salween River. Claire Chennault, not a man given to sentiment, writes in his after-action report that the AVG had staved off China's collapse on the Salween. Hill, when asked about it later, says the bombing run was simply the right angle of attack, which was, in some sense, a perfect summary of everything he had learned in 8 months over the mountains of Burma and China. Find the right angle. Commit to it completely. Do not give the enemy time to adjust. October 25th, 1942. Hong Kong. The mission that earns Hill the Distinguished Service Cross, a decoration that will not actually be formally approved for 60 years because of paperwork and bureaucracy and the ordinary machinery of an institution not quite fast enough to honor its people in real time. Hill is sick, malaria. His temperature is elevated. His hands, when he wraps them around the stick of P-40 number 48, are not entirely steady. He leads 9 Warhawks escorting 12 B-24 bombers on a raid against Japanese-held Hong Kong. Waiting above the target, 24 Japanese fighters. Hill rolls number 48 onto its back and dives, not toward the bombers he is supposed to be defending, toward the Japanese fighters themselves, the ones closest to the B-24s, the ones already positioning for their attack runs. He places his P-40 between the Japanese formation and the bombers it has come to destroy. And the dive carries him through the middle of 24 enemy aircraft at a speed and angle that leave no time for organized response. 1 Japanese fighter comes apart in the first pass. Then Hill and his squadron mates, who have been flying with him long enough to know exactly what he is doing and exactly when to follow, begin their repeated diving attacks, not once, not twice. They slash through the Japanese formation again and again until the Japanese pilots, unable to press their attack against the bombers without taking catastrophic losses, break away. All 12 B-24s return to base. 1 sustains minor damage. The Japanese fighters have been driven off, not through superior numbers, not through superior aircraft, through the repetition of an attack pattern so committed, so completely without hesitation, that 24 Japanese fighters cannot coordinate a defense against 9 Americans who keep coming back. A surviving crew member of one of the B-24s, in a letter to his family written that evening, puts it plainly. He says that the P-40S above them moved in ways he had never seen before and hoped never to be on the wrong end of. That the American pilot who went in first, the one who rolled inverted and dove towards the Japanese before anyone else had moved, had given them what he could only describe as the gift of time. Because of that, he writes, we came home. When the American volunteer group is formally deactivated on July 4, 1942, the official record of its 8-month combat existence reads as follows: 296 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 14 AVG pilots killed in combat, a kill ratio that the United States Army Air Corps, studying the numbers afterward, does not initially believe is accurate. It is accurate. Hill, by the time he finally leaves China in November 1944, he carries a total of 18 and 1/4 confirmed victories. He has flown more than 250 combat hours. He has commanded a flight, then a squadron, then a fighter group. He has been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters. He has been honored by the Chinese government with 6 separate combat decorations. He has been depicted by John Wayne in a 1942 Hollywood film, which he watches with the same quiet amusement he applies to most things about his own story. He does not consider himself particularly remarkable. This is, perhaps, the most remarkable thing about him: the tactics Chennault developed and Hill executed, the dive and zoom, the altitude-first discipline, the slashing attack that refused engagement on the enemy's terms, were adopted in their essential principles by the United States Army Air Forces and applied throughout the Pacific Theater. They are documented in the official tactical manuals of 1943. They inform the training programs that produced the American fighter pilots who finished the war. The study of energy management in aerial combat, the understanding that altitude is stored speed, that a diving aircraft carries momentum that can be exchanged for position or distance or time, traces a direct line from Chennault's notebooks to the fighter doctrines used by every Western Air Force operating today. The tactics are still there, embedded in the way combat pilots are taught to think about the sky. Hill returned to Texas after the war. He joined the Texas Air National Guard. He became, at some point in the 1950s, the youngest brigadier general the Guard had ever commissioned. He tested the first American jet aircraft. He trapped gorillas in Central Africa for a Hollywood production because his appetite for the improbable had apparently not diminished. He attended Flying Tiger reunions until he was old. He talked about his crew chiefs more than himself. He died on October 11, 2007, at the age of 92 in San Antonio, Texas, where he had grown up watching the cadets at Kelly Field and wishing he could fly. There is a way of thinking about the great disruptions of history, the moments when established patterns fail catastrophically against something that simply refused to play by the agreed-upon rules, that reduces them to personality. The maverick, the iconoclast, the man who thought differently. But that reading misses the deeper truth of what happened over the mountains of Burma and China in 1942. David Lee Hill did not succeed because he was reckless. He succeeded because he was, in the deepest sense, precise. Every dive he made was calibrated. Every attack angle was chosen. The pattern that looked from below like chaos, like a pilot who had lost his bearings, who was flying drunk on adrenaline or fear or some excess of American confidence, was in fact the most rational possible response to the specific limitations of his aircraft and the specific vulnerabilities of his opponents. The drunk flying was not drunk at all. It was the clearest thinking in the sky. The Japanese pilots who watched the shark-mouthed P-40 dive through their formations and climb away before a response could be organized were not witnessing disorder. They were witnessing the application of a principle so foreign to their training that their training gave them no language to describe it. There is something in this that extends beyond the technical history of aerial combat. Every institution, every doctrine, every system of established practice contains within it a set of assumptions about how the contest is supposed to unfold. Those assumptions are not usually wrong. They encode generations of experience. They produce competent practitioners, but they also produce a kind of blindness, an inability to process a response that simply does not accept the premises of the established game. Chanot saw that blindness. Hill flew straight through the middle of it 296 times until the war in the China-Burma-India theatre tilted. The shark's teeth grin on the nose of the P-40 was, in the end, the most honest symbol of what these men had accomplished. Something that looked dangerous in a way that defied conventional expectation. Something that came at you from the wrong angle, at the wrong speed, at the wrong time, and was already gone before you had decided how to respond. That is what freedom looks like sometimes when it is under pressure and running out of options and has decided it is not going to lose. It looks from the outside like a man who has no idea what he is doing, and it wins.